to our cognitive psychology topic of the day. So we're going to continue our look at memory. Last time we were looking at memory structures, so the different representations of memory and how they underlie the different types of memory. So implicit versus explicit memory, long-term, short-term, and working memory. We took a look at Clive Waring. Everything's Jarvis now. We took a look at Clive Waring, who had no memory of the past, could form no memories of the future, had almost no explicit memories remaining, no episodic memories remaining, and yet had evidence of implicit memories, such as his feelings for his wife, priming of the way that he talked. So we're going to continue our look at long-term memory, and today we're going to look at encoding and retrieval. So we're going to take a look at a few phenomena and try to explain those. So the first phenomenon that we're going to take a look at is infantile amnesia. So we were all babies at one point, but if you try to go back to the earliest memory that you have, most people cannot go earlier than about 3 years of age. So we're going to take a look at why we have this kind of blackout period from our memories. Why is it that all of a sudden memory started to be able to be accessed, but beyond that time, before that age, is just a blank. We have no memories of what happened to us previous to that time. So we're going to take a look at that, and we're taking a look at encoding. And then we're going to take a look at retrieval and how retrieval can be used to actually change somebody's memory. So specifically, we're going to take a look at a rape survivor who has traumatic emotional memories of her incident, and a new treatment that is being tested that can be developed because of the ways that memory works. So the kind of advancements that we've had in learning how memory is reconstructed every single time that you remember something can now be used to help people who are dealing with traumatic memories. So that's what we've got on the schedule for today. We'll see how far we can get. We're going to take a look at different types of encoding. So we're going to start off with the levels of processing theory. We'll take a look at CogLab number 8. That was the levels of processing CogLab. We're going to take a look at encoding specificity and take a look at CogLab number 9, which was, not surprisingly, on encoding specificity. And then we're going to use those, specifically encoding specificity, to try to understand infantile amnesia. Why is it that we can't remember anything before a certain age? And we're going to take a look at a really cool experiment on the importance of the self in terms of remembering long-term memories. And then we're going to look at memory reconstruction and its use in science fiction. So we're going to take a look and just remind everybody if you haven't seen it, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. That movie was science fiction, but the story of Genevieve, that is science fact, and that is a breakthrough treatment that's being worked on right now to help people basically erase portions of their memory. All right, so the level of processing theory. Levels of processing was an answer to the structural theory of memory. So the structural theory of memory is what we've been looking at so far. It was the idea that memory can be divided into different structures, and those different structures depend upon how things are recalled. So if you have things that are stored in short-term memory, then they will be stored for a short term. If you have things that are stored in long-term memory, then they will be stored for a long term. So when will an item be recalled, or will an item be recalled? That can be answered if you know which structure that memory is stored in. So if it's stored in short-term memory, it will be recalled, but only for a short time. And not a lot of information can be stored in short-term memory. If it makes it into long-term memory, then it can be recalled for a long period of time, and massive amounts of information can be stored in long-term memory. That was the idea behind the structure theory. So this structure theory of memory explained the differences in recall by attributing them to different structures. You can recall something for a long time because it's in your long-term memory structure. You can recall things for a short period of time because it's in your short-term memory structure. So that was that approach to recalling information. The levels of processing theory came up with a different approach. And they said that basically the idea is that we might not actually have these different memory structures. They might be an illusion. What we do have is we have different ways of processing. So processing is what causes different types of memory. So memory is a result of different levels of processing. Short-term memory is the result of one type of processing. Long-term memory is the result of another type of processing. Not different structures, but different ways of encoding the information. So it's an encoding retrieval approach, and the answer to when an item be recalled is completely dependent upon the type of processing that that item went through. So different from the structure approach, it's basically saying that memory is all the same structure, but how you process an item will determine whether that item is recalled at a future time. So the level of processing approach came about because researchers noticed that when you took a look at short-term store, long-term store, and you took a look at the different characteristics between those two types of storage structures, each of them had different characteristics, specifically different characteristics of processing. So we have short-term store here, which is small and can only be recalled for about 30 seconds. We got the long-term store, which is no known limit, no known capacity limit, and can be recalled for minutes to years. And they attributed that, previous researchers have attributed that to the fact that we had a short-term structure and we had a long-term structure. But what they did in the processing approach is they said, all right, maybe it's just levels of processing. Because notice, for everything that is small in capacity and very short term, those have certain types of processing associated with them, right? Those tend to be rehearsal types and phonemic types of processing. We'll talk about what those are in just a moment. When you take a look at what's being recalled to the long-term store, it's usually information that has been organized and has been processed semantically. So it could be that it's a different type of processing that leads to this small, up to 30-second storage versus this incredibly long, no known limit storage. So for these researchers in the level of processing theory, it was how you maintain the information and how you format that information that was important to whether you recall it or whether you don't, whether you have a large capacity or whether you have a small capacity to remember information. So they sidestepped the whole idea of structure, and they sidestepped the whole idea of different kind of components of memory. And what they said, what they substituted for it is this different types of processing, saying that it's the processing that's important and not the actual kind of structures of memory. So levels of processing theory, we mentioned those different levels of levels of processing. Well, it's right there in the name, levels of processing theory. So this was proposed by Craik and Lockhart, and they actually, I believe, did this research at the University of Toronto. So this was kind of, you know, a very proud moment for the University of Toronto, this kind of breakthrough in memory. So in their levels of processing theory, the type of processing was what was important to memory. That determined how much you remembered. So not structures, processing, not where it went, but how it got there, how did you process it. And they had a few assumptions that they proposed for their theory. So we'll go through those. I believe there's 4 assumptions. So the first assumption is that your memory is the result of a series of processes. So memory is a result of how you encode information, and then how you retrieve that information. And the encoding of the information, the processing of it, can go through a continuum. And on one side of the continuum, you have very shallow processing. This is processing where you take a look at perceptual features, for example. So if I asked you to process If I ask you to process that word, I can ask you to process this in a number of different ways. I could ask you to process this in terms of perceptual features, which is shallow processing, such as how many straight lines are there in that word? And you would be like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 11 straight lines in that word. You processed it, right? But you processed it very shallowly. You looked at how many lines there are. You could go slightly deeper, and I could ask you how many vowels are in that word, right? How many syllables are in that word? These are all shallow perceptual features, and that would be an example of shallow processing. On the other hand, you could go into very deep processing. And deep processing is where you process the meaning of what you're trying to remember. So if I asked you to process this word, and I asked you to think about what's the color of this thing, right? All of a sudden, you have to know what this means. You have to process it in terms of meaning. You have to know what an elephant is. One very common task is to ask, is it alive or is it not alive? Right? Is this an animate object or is it an inanimate object? Once again, you have to process the meaning. You need to know what this is. You need to process it semantically. So deeper processing typically is semantic processing, where you process the meaning of what it is that you're trying to remember. So that was assumption number one. Assumption number two is that these levels of processing, the ways that you encode this information, directly determine how long you're going to retain that information. So if you process something shallow, you're going to have very poor retention. You're not going to be able, you're not going to be able to retain very much information, and you're not going to be able to retain it for a long period of time. You're going to have short-term memory if you process something very shallow. On the other hand, if you go through deep processing, you're going to have much better retention. You're going to have a larger capacity to retain, and you're going to have the ability to retain information for longer periods of time. So this is why, if you've ever gone through, the Academic Center for Excellence and asked for strategies on studying, they will recommend strategies that require deep processing of the material. So they'll say things like, don't just keep reading a paragraph over and over and over again. That's rehearsal. That is very shallow processing. They'll probably not use those words, but that's what the intention is. Don't read something just over and over and over again. That's very shallow processing. You won't retain much information. Try to reorganize the information. Take some notes and pull out the key features. Think about the definitions as you're reading it. That's deeper processing, which would lead to better retention. Assumption number three was that rehearsal doesn't directly help memory. So that idea of rehearsing information, that idea of that sort of typical reiterating information when you're trying to remember it. So if somebody's trying to give you a phone number, you just keep repeating that phone number in your head. If they say something like, oh yeah, it's 574-555-2874, if you're just sitting there going 574-555-2874, 574-555-2874, that's rehearsal. And according to Craig and Lockhart's theory, that doesn't actually directly help memory. What it does is it can help memory if it induces a deeper analysis. If all of a sudden you realize something about the information that you're trying to recall, if all of a sudden you process it deeper at a semantic level, then it's easier, then it becomes easier to remember. So it's an indirect benefit. So an example in that phone number is if you ever watch, if you've ever noticed phone numbers in TVs and movies, they use that 555 as the first three numbers because that's nobody has that that code. That's Hollywood's code for fake movie numbers. So if you notice that about the 574-555, it's a lot easier because now to remember because now you processed it more deeply. Now you've given it semantic meaning. It's that fake Hollywood code for phone numbers. All right, and then assumption number four, if you want to study memory, if you want to understand memory, if you want to do experiments on memory, you have to control how the processing is done. So you cannot leave the processing up to the subject. You have to somehow control how that processing is done. So one of the ways you can do this is through implicit learning. So implicit learning is where the subject is unaware that the material will be tested later on. So it's literally the pop quiz of experiments. You give subjects a task to do, and then in the second part of the experiment, you're like, surprise, memory test, how much do you remember? So the task that you give them is designed for them to process the information in a certain way, and then what you do later is you surprise them with a pop quiz on what it was that they just processed. Now, before we go on, I want to point out that this implicit learning, it is using implicit in a different way than we saw with implicit explicit memory. So in implicit and explicit memory, explicit memory was memory you were aware of, memory that you consciously knew you had. Implicit memory is memory that you have, but you're not aware that you have it. Implicit learning is learning that you're doing without knowing that you're doing learning, right? So you're doing a task, and while you're doing the task, you just happen to be remembering that information. So it's when you're not explicitly told to remember the material later on. So implicit learning would be something like, if I gave you a list of animals and other items, and I said, oh, just indicate whether they're alive or inanimate, right? Animate or inanimate, that's the task. That would be implicit learning, because I did not tell you to directly recall these words. Explicit learning, on the other hand, would be if I said, oh, here's a list of words, try to remember them. And in explicit learning, you use whatever strategy you choose to, because you know you're supposed to remember them. In implicit learning, you use whatever strategy the task forces you to do. So if I say something like, tell me if these words are animate or inanimate, that forces you to do semantic processing. If I say, count the vowels in each of these words, that forces you to do shallow processing on perceptual features. All right, any questions on the kind of 4 assumptions? All right. So let's take a look at evidence for this type of theory. So in CogLab number 8, level of processing, so you had 2 phases for this. So in the first phase, you saw a word and you were asked to make a particular judgment. And there were 3 types of judgments. So in the first one, in uppercase, you had to judge, is the word written in uppercase letters? In the second one, rhyming, does the word rhyme with another word? And in the third one, semantic, you had to answer a meaning question about the word. So these were designed to control the processing all the way from shallow, which is the uppercase, through rhyme, which is in the middle level, and then deep processing, which is that semantic task. And your task was just to determine if the word fit the judgment. So in phase 1, theoretically, you didn't know that this was a memory test. Now, whether or not that's actually the case, could be truer or falser depending upon whether you read ahead. But in theory, you did not know that you were going to be doing a memory task. So all you thought was, all right, I just have to determine if the word fit the judgment. So is the word in uppercase? Boat, right? This is lowercase. But notice you can do this task without knowing what a boat is. So if you were somebody who had English as a second language, and you understood what uppercase was, and that's the only thing you understood in English, what uppercase is, you can still do this task without ever knowing what boat is, indicating that it requires shallow processing in order to do, is the word in uppercase. Does the word rhyme with park? All of a sudden, this requires a little bit more understanding. It requires a little bit more processing to determine whether lamp rhymes with park. And then finally, is the word part of the body, cart? Now you have to understand what a cart is. You are forced to process that semantically to identify what a cart is, and then figure out, is that part of the body or is it not? part of the body. All right, so that was phase one. And then when you were done with phase one, you began phase two. And in this phase, you saw a series of words, and half of them had been shown in phase one, the other half had not. And your task was for each word, just indicate if it had been shown previously in phase one. So do you recognize the word from phase one? And the independent variable was the level of processing. So once again, shallow processing, medium and deep processing. Shallow processing being the words that you have to make the uppercase judgment about. Medium processing being the words that you have to make the rhyme judgment about. And then finally, deep processing, the words that you have to make the semantic judgment about. And once again, at the end of phase one, you would begin phase two, and you would just be asked if the word was shown in phase one, and was the word on the list? Rice. So in this case, you would say, no, hadn't seen rice before. Was this word on the list? Cart. Yes, we've seen cart before. Cart was not a part of the body. And then just so on and so forth throughout phase two. All right, so that's the setup. So what are the results for these different levels of processing? So what are the results for the uppercase judgment, rhyme judgment, and semantic judgment? Well, let's take a look. So here we got proportion correct. So how many words did you identify as correctly as being on the list, having been presented before? And then here we have the three different types of conditions. So we got the uppercase condition, that's shallow processing, rhyme condition, that's medium processing, and semantic condition, that's deep processing. And it bears to keep in mind that chance performance on this is 50%. So you got a 50-50 shot. Even if you fell asleep during phase one, you got a 50% chance of getting these right. Because half the words were on the list, half the words were not on the list. And you can see how poor shallow processing is, because it's actually just slightly below chance performance. So the first big result here is that for shallow processing, you're basically at chance levels of performance. If all you were processing was it uppercase or lowercase, you are at chance levels of performance. If the levels of processing theory is true, we should see increases in recall. We should see higher bars as that encoding condition increases in the deepness of the processing. And sure enough, in the rhyme medium processing condition, we see an increase in the retention, the proportion correct. And then finally, in the semantic condition, we once again see the top amount of retention, the most proportion correct. So this is evidence that these different types of processing, these different types of encoding the information make big differences in how you recall the information at a later date. All right, so any questions on those results? Okay. So what kind of learning, specifically learning, was occurring in phase one? So was it implicit or explicit learning? What was the experiment designed to achieve? Explicit or implicit learning? So I heard murmurs of implicit. I'm going to go with that because that's the correct answer. So this was not an explicit memory test. In phase one, you were not told, memorize these words. You were not told, you'll be asked to recall these words at a later date. So in terms of the type of learning that was involved, it was implicit learning. You were not told to learn this information, but you implicitly learned it. You learned it without awareness, and you were tested on that implicit learning later on. All right, what kind of testing, on the other hand, was occurring in phase two? Was that explicit or implicit testing? All right, I hear whispers of explicit. We'll go with that. So, yeah, it was explicit testing in phase two. Because in phase two, they literally came out and said, what do you remember? This is a memory test. So now, consciously, try to remember what you saw before, turning it into an explicit memory test. So according to the level of processing theory, what kind of processing leads to short-term memory and long-term memory? So according to the theory, what's the processing that leads to short-term memory? It's the shallow processing. So it's not a short-term memory structure. It's the fact that when you process information shallowly, you end up putting it into short-term memory. What about long-term memory? What kind of processing is that? Deeper processing. So take a look at when, just as a sort of take-home exercise, Google mnemonic techniques and notice how many of these mnemonic techniques have to do with deeper processing, forcing you into deeper processing. So one of the things that, one of the techniques I've read about before is how to remember people's names at a party, right? When you're being introduced to 10, 15 new people, how do you remember their names? And the one thing that they tell you not to do is to just repeat that person's name in your head. So if you meet somebody and they're like, oh, this is George, you're not supposed to just look at them and go, George, over and over and over again. Why? Because that's shallow processing. That's repetition processing. That's phonemic processing. You're hoping that just hearing their name in your head over and over again will somehow help you remember the information. It doesn't. According to levels of processing, that leads you to short-term memory. So 2 minutes later, when you come across George again, that memory is gone. What they recommend is to try to think about something that is associated with that word George. So if this person is very, very, I don't want to use this straight up, if they're very presidential, you might say to themselves, oh, they're like President George Washington. That's how I'm going to remember them. They're presidential, like George Washington, the first president. If they're wearing an animal print, you might say to yourself, oh, like George of the Jungle, right? They're like George of the Jungle. That's how I'm going to remember them. Deeper processing. You process the meaning of their name. You process their name and what it's associated with. And just take a look at different mnemonic techniques. Just about every single one pushes you towards that deeper processing to improve your memory. And incidentally, this also is why any teacher in any study strategy will always tell you, do not just try to memorize the information, but try to understand the information. Because if you understand the information, you have to force semantic processing. That leads to long-term memory. That leads to success on exams. All right, so any final questions on levels of processing? All right. So let's turn now to a different impact of processing, which is encoding specificity. So we are now going to take a look at the mystery of why we don't have memories for events that happen to us. Basically around 3 years or previous, we have infantile amnesia. So we're all amnesiacs in a certain way, right? Not like Clive Waring, but in a certain way, we're all missing time from our lives. We can't go below about 3 years of age. So why is it that we don't have access to those memories? Are they gone? Are they sitting there, but we just don't know how to read them? We're going to take a look at how encoding specificity might shed light on that mystery. All right, so encoding specificity. Encoding specificity is the idea that when you encode information, you also encode the context. So you cannot just encode a piece of information or a piece of your environment. Anytime you encode information, you encode the context within which that information is presented as well. So if that is true, then you should be able to use context as a cue for memory retrieval. So in this room, as you're learning psychology, you're also encoding other things in this room along with that information. So as you are encoding things about levels of processing, you are encoding the fact that this projector is on. You are encoding that I'm wearing a green shirt. You are encoding that the walls here are, kind of a grayish blue. You were encoding that people were walking outside the door when you heard those, when you heard people talking. You were encoding basically everything else about this room while you're encoding that information. And because of that, you should be able to use that context later on as a cue for memory retrieval. So let's take a look at some evidence for this with the next CogLab, and then we'll take a look at its application for infantile amnesia. So in this next CogLab, Encoding Specificity, in phase 1, you saw a list of word pairs in this case, such as car and then port. And the first word and the second word had a relation where the first word was in lowercase letters, the second word was in uppercase letters, and the first word was your cue, and the second word was your target. So car was the cue. This is the information that you could use to later recall the word port. So the two conditions in this was whether or not the cue was a strong cue or whether it was a weak cue. So examples of strong cues would be something like eat and food. So eat has a lot of association with food. Those two words go together. When you think about eat, you think about food, just naturally. So those two pairs have a lot of context together that they share. Dry, wet. Again, two sides of the same coin, two sides of the same context. Grasp and baby, not so much, right? Now we're getting to weaker types of cues. We have lady and queen, much stronger cue. Those two go together as well. So there was different strengths to the cues and the association between the two. So that was in phase 1, you learned those word pairs. And then in phase 2, you were presented with a strong cue, or you were presented with a weak cue, and your task was to simply produce the target. So they would say, oh, here's the first part of the word pair. What's the second word that went with it? And your independent variable number 1, there's two independent variables. Number 1 was your encoding condition. So did you encode the information with a strong cue? Or did you encode the information with a weak cue? So did you learn the information with eat food, a very strong cue? Or did you learn the information with grasp baby, a very weak cue? So how did you encode the information? And then the second variable was how did you retrieve the information? When you retrieved the information, did you get another strong cue? Or, sorry, did you get the strong cue to retrieve the information? Or did you get the weak cue to retrieve the information? So when you were presented with the word, when you were presented with your cue, was it presented with eat, in which case you had a very strong cue to remember to retrieve food? Or were you presented with, grasp, in which case you had a very weak cue to recall your baby? So how did you learn it? And then how did you retrieve it? And all 4 of those combinations were possible. Learn it with a strong cue, recall it with a strong cue. Learn it with a weak cue, recall it with a strong cue. Learn it with a strong cue, recall with a weak. Learn with a weak and recall with a weak cue. So we'll see. Yeah, basically should have went to this slide before. We'll see which of those are the strongest, and we'll see if you can use the context of the cue to later retrieve the information, and does that depend on whether it's a weak or a strong cue. All right. So in phase 1, end of phase 1, you start your phase 2. So for each of the word pairs, please answer it. What was the uppercase word shown in phase 1? So was the uppercase word on the list? So you would have eat and food, and in this case you would say yes, that was the word that was presented. So that is an example of encoding with a strong cue and then retrieving with a strong cue. You saw eat when you encoded, you saw eat when you retrieved. Both of those are strong cues. If you had something like this during phase 2, where they said, well, here's cave, and it's associated with wet. Was wet on the previous list? Well, that's an example of encoding with a very strong cue, because the cue was dry when we first saw it, dry and wet, very highly associated. Cave, not so much with wet, so that's a weak cue. This is encoding with a strong cue, recalling with a weak cue. Infant baby. When we encoded this, we encoded with a weak Q, right? Grasp is not very strongly associated with baby. But now that we're retrieving it, we have a very strong Q. Infant is highly associated with baby. So we'll even remember baby now that it's being retrieved with a strong Q. And then finally, lady and queen. This one is actually under the weak Q category. I might disagree with that, but encoding with a weak Q and then retrieving, again, with a weak Q as well, we'll see how that context affects the retrieval. All right, so the results. So we have encoding condition down here on the x-axis. We have the proportion correct against, again, higher bars mean better memory. And then we have the retrieval Q here. So blue bars are going to be the strong retrieval Q, and the red bars will be the weak retrieval Q. So this is only for test phase number 2. How did you do in the test phase, in phase number 2? So we'll start off with the strong encoding condition. So when you learned the word with a strong Q, when you encoded that context, when you learned the second word, you encoded a very strong context, and then you were given that strong context to retrieve it, well, we had high levels of performance. So about 70% recall in that situation. On the other hand, when you were recalling, when you encoded with a strong condition, with a strong Q, but then you recalled with a weak Q. So you encoded with a strong Q, but then you recalled with a weaker Q. Well, we saw a decrease in memory performance. So in this case, we saw not as good memory, a dip in memory performance, and again, just about 50%, indicating not good performance whatsoever. So the take home for this is that you have a strong Q. If you're presented with a strong Q at encoding, you get better memory. If you're given a strong Q at retrieval, you get better memory here as well. So these are both strong Q at encoding, so let me restate that. Strong Q at encoding, you get the strong Q, you get better memory after the encoding. So because of this, you might ask yourself, well, what's going on here? Is it just the fact that you had a strong Q when you started encoding this, and you had a strong Q when you retrieved it, so that you remembered that context? Or is it just that a strong Q during the retrieval phase is just better in general? It's just going to help you. I mean, if you say eat, and then you pair it with food in the retrieval phase, of course you're going to remember food, because eat is just a better Q, it's just better associated with food. Well, to answer that, we're going to take a look at the weak condition over here. So when you're presented with a weak Q in encoding, when your context, when you're encoding the information is not that good, not that associated with your word, but then you get that weak context again as a retrieval Q, that is your memory performance for a weak Q and a retrieving it with a weak Q. If you have a weak Q when you encode it, and then you get a new context when you're retrieving it, even if it's a strong Q, even if it's a strongly associated word, if you get a new context, we get lower performance. So strong retrieval cues are not by themselves driving this effect. What's driving this effect is the fact that you have encoded the context, and if it's a weak context, then you have encoded that weak context, and that weak context is your best retrieval cue because you've encoded that with the word that you were learning. So in this case, the weak cue actually leads to better memory. So it's actually the general case is that the matching cue leads to better memory. Because even though strong cues are more associated with a word, when you read those word pairs, you encode both of that information. You can't ignore that first word, even if it's a weak cue. And then when you're recalling the information later on, whatever cue matches the way that you learned the information, that's your best cue to recall your information. All right, so any questions on those results right there? All right. So encoding specificity. So once again, what kind of learning instructions were given in phase one? I just want to make sure that we are very clear on implicit and explicit learning. So what kind of learning was given in phase one? Was it explicit or was it implicit in this one? So I couldn't really make that one out. I'm going to go with explicit, I believe I heard mostly. So in this one, you were actually told to remember the words. So in this one, you were actually told to learn the word pairs. You were actually told to try to remember these word pairs later on. So because of that, that's explicit. When you're told to learn, that's an explicit learning instruction. So in this case, you couldn't control the processing. You could process that information in whichever way you wanted, but if you're told, hey, try to learn these pairs, that's explicit learning. You're aware that you're trying to remember this information. And then what testing instructions were given in phase two? Was it explicit or implicit? So for that one, I think I'm shaking people's confidence now. All right.
Wouldn't it still be explicit because you're still trying to?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So in this case, it was explicit learning instructions and then explicit testing later on. Because once again, it said, do you remember these words? Was this second word associated with the first word? And that's again, explicit memory instructions. All right, and then the last one is an application one. According to encoding specificity, you might notice that during exams, I will put up my PowerPoint slide here, letting you know when the exam ends, and I'll also put up a clock over here. Why do I do that? Why do I not just write it on the board or call it out how much time you have left during the exam? So according to encoding specificity, why is this a good idea?
So that you calling out what time it is doesn't distract us?
Well, me calling out what time it is doesn't distract you. That's one of the reasons why I do it. Because I've always found that distracting when people are like, oh yeah, you got 45 minutes left, you got 30 minutes left, especially in that last little bit when you're trying to finish. You're like, you got 5 minutes left, and that's 4 minutes, and that's 3 minutes. So that's one reason. But more so in terms of encoding specificity, what might the reason be?
This way you can control your processing of kind of noticing the time. Kind of like compare that to time management, I guess.
Yeah, it is more freedom for you as well to kind of check in at a rate that makes you feel comfortable. Let me give you a hint. What mode do I use to deliver information every single class? Has there ever been a class where I don't do this? No. So every single piece of information that you have ever learned in this class, this screen is on. Yes? All right. According to encoding specificity, you have encoded the fact that this screen is on for every single piece of cognitive psychology information you've learned in this class. If this screen is off, you lose it as a cue to try to recall that information. So what I do instead of writing it on the board is, knowing about encoding specificity, I try to keep the context of this room. I try to keep the cues in this room as similar as possible to when you learn the information. So the fact that this screen is on during your exams means that you have a better chance of retrieving information that you learned in this classroom, because this cue of screen is on is present during the exams. This is why if you ever have to write an exam in a different room, your performance will go down, because there are cues all over this room that you can use to try to recall information. And this is something, this is one more, just give you one more example of encoding specificity, one more example about weak cues actually helping you recall things, because this is not a, screen being on is not a huge cue for cognitive psychology information, but it is a cue because of encoding specificity. So I'll give you one last real life example. Have you ever wanted something from the kitchen and went to the kitchen to grab it, and as soon as you got into the kitchen, you forgot what it was that you went there for. Everybody had? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. Yeah, I think everybody has had that experience. What happens as soon as you leave the kitchen and you go back to your original room? You remember what it was that you wanted. Because when you retrieve that information, of saying, oh, I think I'm going to go get myself, a bottle of Powerade, you encoded the information in your living room, let's say. You encoded all of that contextual information, and that's used as a retrieval cue. So once you walk into the kitchen, all those retrieval cues are gone. And you walk into the kitchen and you're like, what did I don't even remember what I wanted. Forget it. And then you walk back into the living room and there are all the cues. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's right. I wanted that Powerade. And you go back into the kitchen to get it. That's encoding specificity. Your living room couch is not a great retrieval cue for this bottle, but it was there when you thought of it, and it got encoded as context according to encoding specificity. All right, so on that note, we're going to now apply this to more than just remembering what you wanted to get from the kitchen. And we're going to try to understand in this last portion of this class, we're going to get to the reconstructed memory and the traumatic memories next time we meet. But just to finish off today, we're going to talk about infantile amnesia and what encoding specificity might, how it might explain infantile amnesia. So the first thing to point out, infantile amnesia is the phenomenon that most people just cannot recall what happened to them before the age of about 3 to 4 years. So if you take a look at the memory curves of people for life events, and we'll zoom in on this, and this is from your earliest memories here when you were young to your latest memories here when you're as old as you can be. And these are different lines from different experiments where they just asked people basically to write down everything that they can remember. Talk about anything that you can remember from your lifetime. And what they found was that you are best at remembering things that just happened to you. So if somebody tells you to write down every single thing that you can remember about your life, you will probably be able to remember a lot of things about today. Right? You'll be able to remember that you were in this class, you'll be able to remember the clothes that you wore, the food that you ate, what time you got up, did you get a good night's sleep, what time did you go to bed the night before, what episodes did you binge on Netflix. You'll be able to remember all that information. Tons of information for recent things. But then as you start going back a few weeks, a few months, a few years, the amount of information you can recall just dips, right? You start to only remember really big events. And then there, as you keep going back further and further and further, there's this little bump over here. And this is when you have memory for a lot of things that occurred to you in life. This is typically like your late childhood, early adolescence is when that typically occurs. And that is explained by just a lot of life events happen at that time, like the first time you graduate, the first time you go out on a date, the first time you drive a car. A lot of big life changes occur. And then as you get closer and closer and younger, your memory starts to die until right about here where that's it. And before that, well, you're still alive, so you're alive here, there's nothing, right? There's just this gap. You just cannot remember what's going on. And one of the possible explanations for this missing information, this infantile amnesia, has to do with the idea of encoding specificity. And it has to do with the idea that the world that you lived in and the context that you had as a baby is massively different than the context you live in and the world you live in right now. And it goes down, right down to perceptual differences and just basically all around differences. So just to kind of give you an example of this, how the encoding might be different. This is you as a baby, this is you as an adult. When you take a look at a baby's face as an adult, and you take a look at a baby's face as a baby, your encoding of this is very much different. So when you take a look at a baby's face as an adult, that's what you see. A baby looking at another baby, that's what they see. And it's actually way worse than that. I couldn't even simulate. So everybody here knows what 20/20 vision is, right? That's basically, you know, excellent adult vision. If you measure a baby's vision when they're born, they're like 2,400. They can see at 20 feet what a healthy adult can see at 400 feet. Their vision is atrocious, right? Absolutely atrocious. And they live in this blurry, buzzing world for the first, you know, few months of their life. So their perceptual world is incredibly different. So whatever they encode at that time will not be able to be used as context because it's very blurry compared to now. Our experience of the world is very sharp. And it extends to our physical world as well. Because when you're an adult, that's the chair that you encounter in your everyday life. When you're a baby, that's the chair that you encounter in your everyday life. It's a very different experience, right? When you're an adult, that's what a dinner party looks like to you. When you're a baby, that's what a dinner party looks like to you, right? When you're a baby, you live in a world of giants and legs, right? That's your experience, that's your world. When was the last time you ever encountered somebody who proportionally, for our size, was 18 feet tall, right? I have been around children where I am 3 times as tall as they are. I can't remember the last time I was around a human being that was 3 times as tall as I am, right? We don't live in a world where we encounter 18-foot human beings, but relative to babies, that's what they live in. That's the world that they live in. So if this is true, that we're encoding the context of the world with our memories, and that context can be used to retrieve those memories, well, we're bound to lose a lot of memories for our young age because the context of what we use to encode those memories are just not available to us as an adult. So all of this context that we encoded with our vastly different perceptual system, we don't have that context anymore. That context is gone. So we might still have the memories, but we just don't have the cues to recall them. And we don't have the cues of this, right? We don't live in a world of giant furniture. So we don't have that cue, that context to recall that information. And I've always been fascinated at how many people love to see and go to places that have giant things, right? So there are so many tourist attractions that are like, come see our giant chair, right? We have a giant chair just here in the park. Or come see our giant, ball of yarn. Or come see our it's usually a chair. Chairs are big on it. I've seen, there used to be this show on Much Music. Much Music is the Canadian version of MTV. And it was called Mike and Mike's Great Canadian Adventure. And all they did was they would play videos, but they would go from town to town going to these big things. And there was literally a giant pierogi on a fork. This one town had a giant pierogi on a fork, and people would come by to see it. And I can't help but think that maybe it has to do with the fact that we just kind of feel like children when we see these things. There's just something about them that brings out these memories of being a child. So, maybe if we did ever encounter 18-foot people and we lived in a world of giants and legs, all of a sudden things would come just flooding back to us. All of a sudden childhood memories would just come flooding back to us. So, think about, again, just how different our lives are, our context is. So just simple experiences, like this. When was the last time that happened to you, right? When was the last time that somebody just grabbed you, picked you up, threw you on their shoulder, and just carried you around like it was nothing, right? I honestly cannot remember the last time that occurred. But this reminded me of a cover for one of my favorite comics, which is the Sensational She-Hulk. And I just wonder if some, 7-foot woman one day just came in, grabbed me, put her on her shoulders, if I would all of a sudden be like, oh, that time at the beach. I remember now. I remember going to the beach when I was 3. Because this child here is encoding a lot of context that he will not experience again unless, as an adult, some giant woman comes by, throws him on her shoulder, and starts carting him around. Mm-hmm.
So according to this, I can take my glasses off and like lay on the floor
According to that, you would have a greater chance of doing it. It can't be, so we're gonna run out of time. There's different components to this. I'll give you a spoiler, but you would be better, you would have a greater chance of recalling it. So the encoding specificity of that would help you recall those particular memories. You know, so yeah, if you do wear glasses, take your glasses off. If you don't wear glasses, wear somebody else's glasses. You know, lie down on the floor and see if those memories come back. But this is kind of like, I'll give you just a real quick kind of other example of this. This is sort of like why certain memories come back to you when you go visit home, right? And you kind of like, you know, you get home and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I remember this, and oh my gosh, I remember that, because the context of your childhood is still there. So that context helps you recall that information that you might not have been able to recall previous to that. So we're gonna end here, but next time, just to give you a preview, next time we're gonna finish our look at infantile amnesia. And one big aspect of encoding specificity that we didn't mention in this, and the only reason why lying down on the floor will not magically cure your infantile amnesia, has to do with the fact that one of the greatest contexts that we have in order to encode our memories is language. And it's not surprising that right around the time when infantile amnesia ends coincides with about the time when real language development begins, when your word explosions begin, when you really start to understand what you are. And we're going to see next time this great video about children who develop a sense of self, and that sense of self is one of the biggest kind of contexts that you can encode things to, is that sense of I'm here, I'm a person, I exist. Yep?
So, did you guys remember the movie I was talking about, Baby Geniuses?
Mm-hmm.
Where, like, all the toddlers have, like, Einstein level intelligence until they, like, realize that they can say words out loud to their parents.
Oh, okay.
Have you seen that movie? Like,
No, I'll be honest, I specifically avoided that movie. Just wasn't at that place in my life for that one. Yeah, but is that what happened with it?
yeah, like, they realize that they're, like, friends for all their age, weren't able to, like, help them with certain tasks anymore, because the more they spoke out loud,
Mm-hmm.
the less they could sustain that inner dialogue with
Oh, okay.
their friends.
Yeah, there's actually, I mean, there is a, just kind of comment on that. There's actually a psychological concept of a brain language, like a mind language. So babies clearly can think. Babies clearly have thought, they clearly have cognition, even before they have language. So for us, when we think, it's so language-based. And language really helps us to think better, right? It helps us to think more clearly. It's one of the reasons why everybody learns a language, right? It's just very good for the able to think clearly. It's great for thinking, able to do stuff and say things. But there is this concept of a mind language called mentalese, and it's the idea that your mind has a sort of built-in language that it uses, and that's what babies use. So they use mentalese, and then once they learn their first language, that gets supplanted with that, you know, language as almost kind of like your processing system for information. So yeah, I mean, I saw the trailers. You know, it's a fantasy movie, but that idea that babies kind of have that language, that mind language, that's something that you know, psychologists have hypothesized actually underlies their cognition. Yep. All right. Any other questions? All right. Enjoy spring break. And